Hello everybody, my name is Eli and this is video number 5 of my sphere project. In this video we're going to go ahead and finish up the inlay that we've been working on, and we're going to be able to move on to the next step after this. Thanks for watching, let's get started. Earlier I talked about multiple ways of being able to glue the veneer onto these dowels. I already showed you how to do it with a veneer bag. This is the second way that I trust the most, even though I don't like using it because it's extremely time consuming and there are a lot of factors that can cause issues with this. But what I did was I took a piece of Corian, any plastic will do, and I used my router bit to cut a groove through that Corian all the way down, creating a negative mold essentially. And the reason I'm using plastic is because the wood glue will penetrate through the veneer and will glue your rod to a wooden mold. Now you can use wood, but you would have to use something like saran wrap in between. You could wax the wood mold, but if you wax the wood mold, then you're going to have to sand all of the wax off of the dowels. Otherwise, when you go to glue the dowels together, they won't stick because there'll be a coat of wax on the outside of it. So I really don't recommend using wax. I just recommend using a piece of plastic, Corian, Delron, anything like that, and avoid using a wood mold. If that's all you have, then stick to using saran wrap so that it doesn't stick in there. The premise here is really simple and really easy. Basically, this dowel fits into the negative mold just like that, and there should be a little bit of wiggle. You probably can't see it right now. I'll bring it up, but there should be a little bit of wiggle with your dowel, and that's because you're not allowing for the thickness of the veneer yet. So what you're going to do is you're going to put glue lightly on about a third of the dowel. You don't want to cover the whole thing because you're only gluing up half of this at a time. If you're lucky, you can get away with doing 2 glue ups. In most cases, you're going to end up doing 3. If you put too little glue on your dowel, you're going to run into issues, and if you put too much, you're going to run into issues. What you want is to be able to stick your dowel on top of your veneer and press it into the mold using usually what I will use is squeeze clamps on top here to hold it in place. And you can kind of, if I can get my camera to focus, you can see what I have here. The issue that I run into here, and one of the reasons why I don't like it, is because if you put too much glue in there and your glue squeezes out up at the top end here, it's really hard to get it cleaned out, and you don't want to let it dry that way. Otherwise, you're going to have lumps in your dowel everywhere that glue kind of squeezed out. But that's a precaution that you kind of have to take doing this method. The other thing is, with this, your dowel has to be exact on diameter. If it's too small or too large, it's not going to fit in the mold correctly. If it's too large, it can possibly shear the veneer off while you're trying to press it in. And if it's too loose, you're not going to get a tight wrap around your dowel. It's going to be lumpy because everywhere it's not touching the negative mold there, you're just going to end up with a pocket of glue inside of there, which is going to cause a lump. The third method of gluing this up is actually my least favorite, and that's because it requires anywhere from 3 to 4 glue ups, and I actually don't have it in front of me, but I think I can explain it kind of well. If you don't have plastic to do this, and you don't have a veneer bag, what you can do is use a piece of stiff foam, like the white foam that they box things in, or you can go out and get yourself some of the insulating foam that goes around pipes for underneath of your house to keep them from freezing. And you can use a clamp. You can use a hard surface, a hard flat surface. You put your foam on top of it, and you can use your clamps to just press your dowel with the veneer down into the foam, and that foam is going to wrap around and kind of conform to the shape of your dowel and glue it on. But that requires more glue ups because you can only glue up about a third of the dowel at a time, versus with a negative mold you can do roughly half of it at a time. But that's why I like the veneer bag, because I can put it in the bag and it'll get the whole thing all at once. Now that we've got all the dowels veneered, we're ready to move on to the next step, which is cutting the groove in these dowels that will allow them to nest inside of each other and create the pinwheel effect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the camera off the mount and I'm going to show you the router that I have set up here, and I'm going to explain how I use it real quick. Some of you are going to be wondering why I have set up a router in this manner to run these dowels. And let me start by saying that I actually, if you come over here with me for a second, I have a router table. It's right there, and I have another one back in that corner somewhere, and I actually have a router table built in on this table saw here. But the reason why, and I actually prefer to use a router table, but the reason why I set it up like this is because I want to demonstrate how anybody can create this project with the bare minimum of tools. And all you really need to pull this off is a router and a little bit of creative thinking here. And I'll show you what I did. Now you can make your own router table. You can just take a piece of plywood and screw your router to the base of it. If you don't want to go through that effort, what I've done here is I've taken 2 pieces of 1-inch MDF and I've cut them and put them in my table, and I've just kind of set my router on top of it. Well, this router, I just put a bead of CA glue on each side of the router to hold it in place and keep it from moving, and then I've clamped it to the table back here. So this is a really basic router table setup. And once you've got your router put into place and you've got it set up and you're ready to start cutting, you've got your 5/8 inch router bit is set up in there. You actually want to, this is where you start to make your jig that's going to allow you to put the dowels in it and run it through that router. Now this fence here, this guide that I have set up, I didn't measure anything special. I put my router bit in, I roughly held it off there 3/4 of an inch. I just eyeballed it and I glued it down with CA glue. That's it. There's no special, I don't have any specific measurement that it has to be. It has to be on there. And the thing is, you want that router bit pulling in towards your fence. If it's going the other way, it's going to push your project away from the fence, and you're never going to get it right. So let's go over here and take a look at the jig that we made. I'm going to actually put this back in the tripod, and we're going to talk about the jig. We have to be able to hold our dowels in place while we're running them through the router to cut the groove in them. In order to do that, we need to create a jig, which is what I have here. And as you can see, it's just a really simple block of pine. It's a piece of old 2x4 that I squared up on my table saw and with my planer and everything. And I made it perfectly square. I knocked the edges off so there's no sharp edges on it. Even in here, I sanded the edge just a little bit. That's just so I don't get a splinter while I'm using it. A key factor here is you want your jig to be slightly shorter than your dowels. Let me stick a dowel in here real quick and show you what I mean. If you look at that end, my dowel is sticking out of the jig by about 1/4 of an inch. And the reason that I did that is we're going to wedge these dowels in here, and in order to get them out of this jig here, you may have to tap on this end to knock it out, because it's going to be in there pretty tight. All I did to set this was I slowly raised my 5/8 inch router bit up and up and up, and just kept cutting the groove in the block until my dowel would fit in there and it was flat across. And once I got that done, I actually raised it up just a hair, so that my dowel is, you can see the little bit of wiggle that I have there, up and down. There's no wiggle side to side, it's just up and down. There's just a little bit, because what we're going to do is we're going to have to wedge this in here, and I'll go over that in a second. On the back of the jig, you can see I have a piece of, this is 3/8 inch thick maple. It's nothing special, that I just glued on the back there. I just use CA glue to do it, because that's going to keep the dowel from pushing out the back side. And you can see it's got a groove here, but don't worry about that. Just cut your groove and then put your piece on there. And one other factor here that I need to show you, if I can get the camera to focus on it, is you will see in here, let me get something here so I can kind of point to it. Hopefully you can see right at the point of my square here. Let me see if I can get this camera to focus. It doesn't want to. But there is a pin here and a pin here. And what that is it's a screw that I drove through the piece of maple here. I drilled a hole first, and then I put the screw through. And there's two sharp pins back here. So what I do when I put my dowel in the jig is I set my dowel in the jig, and then I give it a tap down onto those two sharp points. And what that does is it acts as an anti-rotation pin of sorts. It's going to help prevent this dowel from twisting as you run it through the router. Now, just for demonstration purposes, I actually ran a dowel through there without the rotation pin, and this is what happened. As you run it through that router, it's going to want to twist that dowel, and you're going to end up with a piece that looks like this. And that's basically no good. But this was just a test piece, a test dowel that I was using to set the depth for my cut to get the dowels to nest properly. So if you have any questions about this jig, if anything is unclear, feel free to ask questions in the comments below, because I still have a lot of this project to go, and what I can do is I can add into the video later on any questions or anything that I've missed, and we can straighten that out real easy. So now that we've got our jig made, we're ready to start figuring out the depth of the groove that we need to cut, which is going to end up looking like this. Hopefully you guys can see that. It looks like a half moon there. And we need to figure out the depth in order to get the 5 pieces to nest into each other properly. And how I do that is I went to the hardware store and I just bought some of these 5/8 inch dowels. They're 4 feet long. I bought 4 of them, and I cut them into lengths that are the same length as the actual dowels I'm going to be using. And what we're going to do is we're going to practice on these pieces until we've got the depth of our router exactly the way we want it to be. Now, if you just set this in your jig and you push it up against your anti-rotation pins and you set it in there, that's not enough. You have to have something in here to create a wedge to make it really tight in there. Now, if you did this proper, your piece should slide in there with just a little bit of resistance. But we need a little more than that. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I've taken a piece of business card. You can use sandpaper, whatever you have, but paper seems to work just fine for me. And I'm going to take these pieces of paper and I'm going to set them at 3 spots across my jig. And when I push my dowel in, it's actually going to take quite a bit of force to get that dowel to nest in there properly. You may even have to go as far as taking a block of wood and tapping it into place. But once you've set it in there, you're going to stand it up on end, tap it into your anti-rotation pins, and then you're just going to trim off your pieces of sandpaper or whatever it is, because you don't want these hanging down. It's just, it won't work that way. Now, these pieces of paper, you should be able to use them over and over and over again. You should be able to do all of your dowels with just these 3 pieces of paper. You shouldn't have to cut new ones for every single dowel that you're going to run. So now that I'm ready to run this, we're going to go over to the router, and we're actually going to start cutting these grooves, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. Now, I've already figured it out, but we're still going to kind of go, I'm still going to show you how to do the router thing and all that. So let's go over there and take a look at it, and we'll go from there. Okay, so we've got our router set up, we've got our jig made, and we've got our test dowel inside of our jig. And what we're going to do is we're going to lower the bit down. We're just going to hold it up there, and we're going to lower the bit down until it's taking out just like a half moon cut out of this dowel. And what I did was I took 2 of the dowels that I bought. They're 4 feet long. I cut them into the sections. I ended up with like, I think I got 4 of them out of each, no, 5 of them out of each dowel, maybe, something like that. So I ended up with 10 of them. And I set this bit lower than what I expected it to be, and then I made my first run. And you're going to slowly start to raise that bit up with every pass until you get it set exactly how you want. Now, the reason why you need so many dowels is because, number one, once you've made that cut, you're never going to be able to nest it back in here and line it up properly again. Second, you're going to have to cut this dowel up in order to see if your groove is proper. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this groove and show you the next step after that. It's really simple. I guess I got to plug it in first. Take care of that. So we're going to go ahead and run this this groove, and then we're going to cut it up and look at it. Wait for that bit to stop spinning real quick. Now what you'll notice is that I pushed this thing through 4 times. Even though this is a brand new sharp bit, it's never a 100% clean cut the first time you run it through there, especially with a ball nose bit. So I like to run it through there at least 3 times. The 4th one is just kind of an extra measure to make sure it's cleaned up. And that's going to basically eliminate any ripples or anything in there. And if you were to run your finger down this, you would see it's actually really smooth. There's no ripples at all. And if you look at the end, if I can get my camera to focus, I'll move it back here. You can actually see the half moon shape that it cut into my dowel right there. So we're going to take this piece out of the jig now. And because it's in that jig so tight, again, I'm going to have to take something and just kind of tap the end of it until it comes out of there. And my pieces of paper are still there. I can use them again. So now that we've got our piece, we're going to cut it up and see if they nest together properly. So I've taken my piece out of the jig and I have it here. This is my test dowel. And I'm just going to take a piece of, this is 400 grit sandpaper, and I'm just knocking the fuzz off of that edge. I'm not sanding anything, but you'll notice that you'll get a fine fuzz along each of these edges, and you just want to get rid of that. It's going to make it easier to fit it together. Now on the chop saw, I'm not cutting it to any specific length. I'm just going to use the end of my guard here to kind of measure the length, and I'm going to cut 5 sections off of this thing. This is why you can't reuse the dowels, because you're going to chop each one of them up as you slowly move that router bit up and up and up. You're going to keep cutting these dowels up. So let's go ahead and cut this into the 5 pieces. Okay, so I've got my 5 pieces here, and we're going to go glue them together real quick. So I cut my 5 pieces, and they're all to the same length. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue them together and test fit them and see how well they fit together. In order to do that, I'm just going to use CA glue because it sets up real quick. I'm not doing anything permanent here. I'm just test fitting them together to make sure that they're going to work. And it's real simple. You're just going to put a little bead of glue in there. Take your piece, spray it with a little bit of CA glue, and I'll glue these together real quick, and then I'll see if I can give you a closer look real quick. Okay, what I've done here with these moon pieces is I've lined the corner up with the corner and kind of glued it into place, and I'm going to continue around and see how they meet up in the end. I'm just going to do this with all 5 pieces one at a time, try and get the dust off of them. And it's actually a really simple process. Like, it might seem more complicated than it actually is. It's really not complicated at all. You just need what you're doing is you're checking to see if the depth of your router is proper, because you don't want to start cutting into your finished dowels and realize that, oh no, it's not quite right. You've already cut up a couple dowels and now you're in a bad position. Now, I already know that what I have is good because I've gone through the process, and when you slide that last piece in, it should just nest right in there, and there should be no gaps. Everything should be tight. And I'm going to show you real quick, because you can see off to the side here, I have the pieces that I did leading up to getting my final piece here. And I'll show you what they look like. On my first run, which was this one, it was almost perfect for 4 pieces to nest together. Now, depending on how high or low that bit is set, you know, you can do as many of these half moons as you want. The deeper the bit is, the more of those half moons are going to fit in there. But you still have, you know, if you want to do 10, you still have to figure out the proper setting so that the last one just nests in there properly. So the first one that I did actually came out perfect for 4 dowels, and I knew that wasn't what I wanted, so I readjusted it, and I ended up with this one. And you can see as I glued the 4 dowels together, the focus on this thing is really annoying. As I glued the 4 dowels together, I was left with a small gap here, but my next piece doesn't fit in there. It won't slide in. So I reset it again, and what ended up happening is I was too loose. And what you can see is these are 5 dowels, but I have a small gap here. So then I had to start backing the router bit back down and making that groove a little more shallow. So that was the 3rd one. There was the 4th one. You can see that the gap is still there a little bit, but it's closer. And then there was the 5th one, and it's a little bit closer there. And then the 6th one, which is this, came out perfect. So at that point, I know I can go ahead and I can start running my finished dowels through there. And that's what I'm going to go ahead and do. I'm going to go ahead and run them through, and then we're going to go over the process of how I actually glue these things up. I don't really think I need to show you me cutting these things up, because I've already done it with the practice dowel, and it's the same procedure. You're going to put your business cards or whatever it may be in your mold there. You're going to press your piece in, but you want your open space where you don't have the veneer to be down. And it doesn't need to be perfect, it can be in there, but I like to center it up, press it in, because then your recess is going to cut out that area there, and you're just going to have a half moon shaped dowel that's veneered at that point. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these up, and when we come back, we're going to be doing the glue up for these. And that's actually a simple process. I have a couple tricks up my sleeve, and we'll talk about all that. As you can see, I've already glued the blank together. I filmed the glue up process, but the footage wasn't really good enough to put in here. There were a lot of issues with it. But it's a really simple glue up process. All you're going to do is you've got your dowels that have the recess cut in it so they can nest into each other. I put the glue on the inside of the recess, not on the outside of the piece, but on the inside of the recess. And I don't want to use too much glue because you don't want a lot of squeeze out in these valleys up here. If you end up with a lot of squeeze out up there, you've got to clean it out somehow. And if it's already dry, it's just a nightmare. So what I did was, on the inside, I put the glue slightly heavier, and on the outside, towards the outside edge, the glue got a little bit thinner, but there was still plenty of it there. And then I used rubber bands to pull it all together. Now, in most cases, I save my rubber bands. I take them off with a workpiece if I'm using rubber bands. There's a lot of different glue-up methods. But in this case, I don't save the rubber bands because, as you can see, there's so many of them on there and they're so tightly wound. Getting them off of there is going to be a nightmare. So I usually go to the dollar store or something when I'm doing a project like this and just pick up the real cheap bag of rubber bands, because what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to cut them off with a razor blade. It's actually a lot easier to do it this way than to have to try and take them off individually. So let's take these things off of here and see what it looks like underneath. It only takes a couple minutes to cut them all off. I'm not pressing too hard with the razor blade. I don't want to put a bunch of cuts into my actual piece. I just want to get the rubber bands off of there. So now that the rubber bands are off, we can kind of see what this thing looks like in its raw form here before we put the edge around it. And for some people, you can leave it like this, because what you can do is this is a lot of inlay pieces actually. This is about 8 inches long, so if you're doing 1/4 inch thick inlays or 1/8 inch thick or whatever it may be, what you can do is, if you're doing like a woodworking project and you want to do these on drawers or a box, you just put it onto your piece, trace it, get in there with a router and rough it out, and you can slice your piece and put it in there. So you can use these inlays just like this. You can even do it with wood turning projects, but that's really not what the look I'm going for here. So I'm going to kind of pull out my drawing and I'm going to explain our next step, and then we're going to get into that. As you can see, there's no squeeze out. Well, I don't want to say no squeeze out, because you can see right here I've got some squeeze out, a couple little bubbles that I'm going to have to get rid of. And down here, I don't know if you can see it or not, I've got some squeeze out there and in this corner. But it's fairly minimal, and it's something that I can easily get in there with a razor blade and kind of pop that squeeze out of there. So let's move on to the next step of this project, and I'll see you in a minute. Now that we've got our inlay piece all glued up, which would be the core of the inlay, we have to start cutting our pieces that are going to create the outer edge, which is going to be what I just colored in right there. We need to create this perimeter, which means we need to surround this inlay with more Brazilian cherry. And how we're going to do that is we've got to cut some pieces that are going to look like this. We're going to cut some pieces that look like this to begin with. And what's going to happen is, after we've cut these pieces, we're going to cut them at an angle. And those pieces are going to kind of fit around the perimeter and create the outside border of this. And what I like to do is I cut this arc here deeper than what I actually need, because what I want is for that arc to actually kind of, if I draw on this piece, the angle's going to come like that. And hopefully you can see what I'm doing there. But what I want to do is I want to make sure that my points in here are lining up perfectly. So I'm going to cut the arc or the recess in this piece slightly deeper than what I actually want. And then I'm going to set my angle on the table saw and slightly, very slowly move that angle in and make individual cuts until I've got this exactly to where I want it to be. And I'll explain that a little bit more when I get to the table saw, but I just wanted to give you kind of a visual reference of where we're going to go from here, and I'll go into a little bit more detail as we go. But right now we're going to go over to the router table, and we're going to cut these grooves in here. Now the width here it can be wider than what you actually need, and it's obviously got to be wide enough to cover your inlay here. In my case, I'm just going to make the pieces about 1 inch wide. That's more than enough. I'm talking about 1 inch from total. And after I cut that 1 inch total width there and cut my groove, then I'm going to kind of mill it down to where it fits into my inlay piece. I don't know if I described that very clearly, but I'm going to try to go into a lot more detail as we're actually cutting the pieces out. So let's head over to the router table and we'll get started on this. Okay, we're back over at the router table, and I've cut the pieces that I'm going to use to wrap my inlay to give it the border around the outside. And I've cut 6 of these pieces because, as I've stated in the past, I like to have an extra just in case I make a mistake on one. It's too hard to go back and try and reproduce that piece exactly the same as the others. So what I've done here is my pieces are 5/8 of an inch thick, 1 1/4 inch wide, and slightly longer than my inlay piece itself. I have my router bit still set up in the same router, and all I did was I marked the center of the piece. I held that mark over the center of the router bit, and then I used a piece of 1 inch MDF that I pushed up against my piece with it marked here. And then I just glued it to the router base with some CA glue so that it's not a permanent thing. I can pop it off real easy after I make the cuts. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to slowly raise the bit until my piece properly nests into the outside radiuses of my inlay. And it's probably kind of hard to see that right now. That's why I drew it out. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and make a couple cuts and see if I can get it close to where I want it to be. And after each cut, you want to check it for the right depth, and you can see it. Hopefully you can see in that. I'm still quite a ways away from having it to where I want to be. So I'm going to raise it up a little bit more, make another cut, and I'm going to continue that process until I get it to where I want it to be. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then we'll come back and look at the piece. I've got to cut all 6 of these pieces so that they're exactly the same. The process is pretty simple. You're just going to slowly raise the bit until you're at the right depth. So I'm going to go ahead and cut them, and then we're going to come back and take a look at it. So I've cut all the pieces that I need to wrap my inlay piece and create the border around the outside. And I'll see if I can show it to you here. You can see the groove that I've cut in there, and I slowly moved the router up until it was cut to the proper depth. And I don't know if you can see it in the video. Let's see if I can get this thing to focus. There we go. At the top here, where my piece fits in, you should have when you press it down tight, it should be touching in the two corners, and you should have a slight gap. In other words, this groove is cut slightly deeper than what you need. And the reason that I do that is because when you glue this blank up, it is almost impossible to get this thing done without a slight twist or without a slight imperfection in it. And I can see the slight imperfections. And in order to get this piece properly lined up, you want that little bit of extra in there so that you can slowly move up on it with the table saw until it fits exactly how you want it to fit. So what we're going to do now is make a jig to cut these things on the table saw. So I'm going to set up to do that, and I'm going to show you how we do it, and then we'll move on from there. Okay, so I've cut my pieces of Corian. Alright, so I cut my pieces of Corian. I actually have 3 pieces of Corian here, as you can see. And the way that we're going to set this jig up is actually really simple. I don't know which direction your personal table saw tilts in. Mine actually tilts to the right. I know some table saws will tilt to the left. But in my case, what I want to do is set my, my piece of wood that I'm going to be cutting the angle on to the outside edge of the Corian in the direction that my table saw is going to tilt. I don't know if that makes sense. Hopefully it does. And I'll see if I can show you what I mean. Because my table saw tilts to the right, my angle is going to be coming in at this direction. So I want my wood, the side of my angle that I'm going to be cutting, to be lined up with the Corian perfectly straight. And this is really easy to do. I'm trying to make it as simple as possible, but I feel like I'm complicating things here. I'm going to line up my piece of wood as perfect as I can just by feeling the edge. And then I'm going to take my second piece of Corian, which is going to be my actual straight edge, and I'm just going to press it up against the side of that. Double check that I'm smooth here. And then I'm going to glue this piece in place, just using some CA glue. Nothing special. Now, for this jig, you can use whatever you want. You can use MDF, plywood, plexiglass, it doesn't matter. This jig typically is, for me anyways, it's like a temporary jig because every time I make one of these they're slightly different. So this is like a one-time use jig. After this it's probably just gonna end up going in the trash, and the next time I do one I'll make, because it's so fast to make this jig, I'll just end up making another one the next time I do it. Now this third piece of Corian here is the stop, so that it's not going to be wanting to slide back as you're cutting through there. And this piece doesn't require anything special. I'm just going to put a drop of CA glue on the back of it, spray a little bit of accelerator there, and just press it into place. And like I said, all that's going to do is prevent that piece from sliding back off there as I'm cutting. Now, how I hold these pieces in place, this is all set up. And actually, just to show you, I've already kind of set one up, but I wanted to do it for the camera and show you how I do it. So this is the one that I'm actually going to be using, but as you can see, they're the same thing. So how that piece is held into place there, you see how it's not falling out of there when I move around? It's not double-sided tape. I know a lot of people like double-sided tape, and I use double-sided tape a lot for a lot of different things. But For jigs like this, I prefer to use Super 77 spray from 3M, and all I do is I take my jig, and I'm not going to actually spray here because I don't want to get it all over my table saw, but I'll have a piece of paper or a piece of plywood that it sits on that I can throw away, and I just make a couple passes with the spray, let it sit for about, I don't know, 10-15 seconds, and then just press my piece in, make sure it's tight, and that's going to hold it just as good as any double-sided tape will. So let's go ahead and set up to make the cuts for our angles here, and I'm going to go ahead and rearrange the camera, and then we'll come back. Figuring out the angle to cut your piece at is relatively simple. Most of you have been doing woodworking for a while, already know how to figure out your angles, but just in case you don't, because I have 5 sides here, I have 5 inside points, so I'm going to take 360 degrees and divide it by 5, which is going to give me 72. And if you divide that in half, it's going to give you 36, which is the angle that you want on each piece. Now I always use my digital angle finder to let me turn it on here. I usually use my digital angle finder to get my angle, and this one here, when I set it on my blade, is actually going to read 72 degrees, not 36, which is fine. It works. So I'm going to set my blade at the 72 degrees so that I can cut my piece. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to slowly start moving in. I'm going to make my initial cut, which I already did. And I'll see if I can get the camera to focus well enough here. Maybe it will. I'm not to a sharp point. It's hard to see, but I'm up at this corner. I'm not to a sharp point yet. There's still a little bit of a flat spot. And I'm going to slowly move up until I just hit that point. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop this piece off and spin it around, and that's why I have this straight edge here, because when I pop this piece off and spin it around and push it up tight, it should give me a pretty exact cut on the other side to get it to the right width. Hopefully I'm explaining this in a way that makes sense. If it doesn't really make sense to you, then ask questions in the comments below, and I might be able to revisit this video in a future video and maybe cover any questions that you might have. So what I'm going to do is slowly cinch this up, and I'm going to make another cut and see if we can get it closer to this point here that we want. Okay, so that cut actually brought my point right up to the edge there. It's exactly where I want it to be. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and cut all 5, because all 5 pieces that I have, well, 6 pieces, are exactly the same width. So I'm going to cut 5 of them. I'm going to leave the 6th one off to the side in case there's a mistake made and I need that piece. I can come back and make this adjustment for the 6th piece pretty easy, so I'm not worried about that. But I'm going to go ahead and take all 5 pieces. I'm going to make the exact same cut, and then we're going to start working on the other side of the angle. So I'm going to make those cuts, and then I'll come right back and we'll go from there. So I've cut the angle on one side of all 5 of my pieces, and what I'm going to do now is I've got to cut the angle on the other side. So I've cinched the table saw up until I'm cutting my angle right to the point there. And what I should be able to do is just take my piece, as you can see I've already got one glued in place there, and just spin it around and stick it in place. And that should cut it to the exact same dimension as you have on this side, because everything's already set. And the whole point of a jig like this is to make your cuts as accurate as possible and as straight as possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and turn all 5 pieces around and make that angle cut. And I'm slowly going to move the saw in until, grab my piece here, until my angles, or until my pieces fit inside of there tightly. I don't want any gap. I'm just going to slowly, and this takes some time, that's why I'm not filming the whole thing. Just to cut the angle on these 5 pieces took me about 15 minutes. And to make the final adjustments and everything and slowly move that table saw in to where it's exactly where I want it to be. It's probably going to take about a half an hour or more to do the final cuts and to get it exact in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and make the cuts, and then I'm going to show you, you know, it's real simple. You're just putting it in your jig, you're making a pass, and after you cut your piece with it still glued in to the jig, you're just going to hold your inlay piece up there and see how close you are, and you're just going to slowly move it in until it fits exactly where you want it to be. And then you're going to move on and cut the rest of the pieces. And this is why I have that 6th piece, because when you're making these final cuts here, your first one is where you're going to slowly adjust it until it's where you want it to be. And if you overdo it, then you have that 6th one where you can go back and kind of get it to where you want to be, and then you can make all your cuts on the final pieces. Hopefully I won't have to use that 6th piece, but we'll see. So I'm going to go ahead and make these cuts, and we'll see how it fits after that. So I went ahead and glued the pieces onto the perimeter of my inlay. I decided not to show the glue up process because it's pretty self-explanatory and easy to do. I just put glue in the grooves and wrapped it in rubber bands to hold it all together until the glue dried. I did want to show everybody that I actually made a mistake while I was cutting out the perimeter pieces, and I had given it some thought on just repairing the mistake and nobody would ever see that it was there. But instead I decided to show the mistake and also show how to repair the mistake so that nobody would know it was ever even a thing. Because part of this entire process is making mistakes. This is the first time I've had this particular mistake happen, and I think it's just because I got a little bit sidetracked with trying to film everything and do it and make the pieces all together. So because I'm not used to having to stop and press pause and record and things like that, what I ended up doing was I set the table saw at the wrong angle. The angle that I figured was correct, but I set the table saw at the wrong angle and I went ahead and cut all the pieces. The real mistake that I made was I didn't check the first 2 pieces to see if they fit right. If I had done that, then I would have only had to repair one little section, but instead I have to repair every single corner. So let me show you what the mistake was, but first I'm going to cut the rubber bands off of here. There's no need in trying to pull them off individually. Again, I just use cheap rubber bands so that I can cut them off when I'm done. It just saves me a lot of times, and rubber bands aren't expensive anyway. So let me go ahead and do that real quick. Okay. Alright, so now that the rubber bands are off and I can hopefully get this thing to focus on it. There we go. What I did was I set the table saw at the wrong angle. So as you can see, on every corner I have a gap here. Now, when I pushed them together, my first thought was to just go ahead and remake all the pieces. But it really doesn't matter. What I'm going to do is just cut a wedge that fits down in this groove really tight, clamp them in place, and let the glue dry. And when I'm done, you'll never even, as long as your glue joint is as tight as you can possibly make it, you will never see this joint in here. Because remember, when we turn this piece on the lathe to make it round, These seams down in here are only going to be about roughly an eighth of an inch long that you will see. So if your seam is extremely tight, you don't need to go through a lot of effort to repair a mistake like this. Just cut your wedges and glue them in, and they will pretty much disappear. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and cut the wedges and get started on gluing them up, and then we'll come back and take a look at it after I'm done with that. As you can see, I've made the necessary repairs. All I did was cut some wedges to fit into the gaps, and I glued them in there. The glue that I used is just epoxy, but I mixed it with some of the rosewood dust, and I made the rosewood dust super fine. I sanded a piece of rosewood with 400 grit until I had a pretty good pile of dust, and what that allows the glue to do is to absorb the color into the glue, which gives you a perfect color match and makes the glue joints pretty much invisible. So I don't think we'll have any issues with this once it's all said and done. So we've got everything squared away, got the wedges glued in how we want them to be, and I'm back at my shop at my house where we're going to turn this thing on the lathe. What I want to do is have a finished diameter of 1.5 inches for this, but I'm going to wrap a veneer around the outside of that diameter, so I've got a white accent line around it. So I've got to take into account the thickness of that veneer as I'm spinning it on the lathe, which is basically exactly the same method I use to allow for the veneer on my smaller dowels here. What I'm going to do real quick is I'm just going to take this spring-loaded center punch, and I'm going to mark my centers so that I can chuck it in the lathe. And then we're going to chuck it in the lathe and go ahead and turn it, and we'll come back and take a look at that in just a second. Okay, so I've already rough shaped my inlay piece. Right now, the diameter is exactly at 1.5 inches, but I need to allow for the veneer that I'm going to wrap it in. If you're not going to wrap it in a veneer, obviously, you don't need to worry about that. What I've done to make my job easier is I've got my set of calipers, micron, whatever you want to call this thing, and I took the veneer that I'm going to be wrapping it in. This is a piece of the actual veneer. It's not from a different sheet or a different bundle. You want to use the same veneer that you're actually going to be wrapping this in. And I super glued it to each side so that I can check it with the veneer glued on. And once I reach 1.5 inches, then it's already allowed for the veneer. Now there are other ways you can do. You can just zero it with your veneer in there, and that's going to do the same thing. But I like to do it this way. Now the reason that I'm going with 1.5 inches or 1.5 inches is because I'm going to be using a Forstner bit. Here we go. I'm going to be using a Forstner bit to drill the holes to set this inlay in. Now the reason I like using Forstner bits is because you can get them in all different sizes, all the way up to 4 inches that I've seen. You can probably get them bigger. So it's really important that you're not over 1.5 inches, because if you're over 1.5 inches, it's not going to fit into the hole you drill. You can't make the Forstner bit larger, and if you're at some weird dimension on your Forstner bit, well then you're causing yourself a lot of problems. If your inlay piece is slightly smaller than 1.5 inches, then you can actually chuck your Forstner bit into your lathe, hook up a piece of sandpaper or to your grinder, and actually
this inlay piece is finally done. It's wrapped in the veneer and it's ready for the next step in the process of this project.
Than trying to make it bigger to fit your piece that's too big. So I'm going to go ahead and finish getting this to the exact same size, to the exact size that I need, and then we'll go from there. I want to thank everybody for showing up and watching these videos. It's taken a lot of time to get to this point in the project, and it's taken even more time to edit and document it. I'm not really that good at that type of thing. I'm more of a craftsman, and this is a learning process for me. This is only about halfway through the project at this point. We still have a lot to do. We have to actually inlay the pieces that we just made into the spear. Then we have to turn the spear to the proper size and shape. After that, we have to make a finial and a hanger, and then we have to actually finish the project. And I still haven't decided whether I want to make an individual hanger to display this, or if I want to use the one that I already have. But we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. I want to say to everybody that's watching, if you are frustrated by what you're seeing and you think that you can't pull this off, you can. Even if you try and you fail, you're going to learn from those failures. If I showed you every single time that I failed, it would probably outweigh the amount of times that I have actually had success. And I think that that's really the key to how I'm able to be so patient and work through these problems, is because I've dealt with the frustration and the anger of making mistakes and being so far into a project and just having to throw the entire thing away and start over again. And really, this type of work is a process. It's a process of finding out what your capabilities are and pushing beyond those capabilities. Whenever I set a goal for a new project, I make sure that that goal is what I consider to be 2 or 3 notches above what my actual skill level is. And then I work to overcome whatever problems that I may face to create the project that I see in my head. So don't give up on what you're doing. And if you want to try this, please feel free to ask me any questions in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer them, maybe even possibly make a video to better explain it. If you want more content, check out my Instagram page. It's at Eli Polite. It's just my name. And I want to thank everybody again for tuning in. The next video, we're going to actually see what this spear is going to look like. We're going to actually physically be able to hold in our hands what I have seen in my head for the last 6 months. And that's a big step. And that right there kind of overpowers any frustration that I might have along the way, seeing it as a physical object. Anyways, thanks again, and I'll see you for video number 6, hopefully in a week or 2.